Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday. Today on History Calling we've reached the 10th video in my Tudor Monarchs series. You can access the rest through the link on screen and in the description box, and the first dealing with the life of Elizabeth I. It'll cover her birth, her education, and what turned out to be a dangerous childhood and adolescence, as she went from Princess of England to illegitimate offspring of Henry VIII thanks to the fallout from the death of her mother Anne Boleyn. You'll hear how she got along with her many stepmothers, especially Catherine Parr, and about her scandalous and very inappropriate relationship with her stepfather Thomas Seymour. Stay tuned to hear about his morning visits to her bedroom, the evidence the 15-year-old Elizabeth gave when she was interrogated about their dealings with each other, and how the actions of both were interpreted by contemporaries and modern commentators, including rumours that Elizabeth was pregnant by him. Elizabeth was born on the afternoon of the 7th of September 1533 at Greenwich Palace, the daughter of Henry VII and his second wife Anne Boleyn. Henry and Anne had had a tumultuous few years to get to this point, as Henry had abandoned his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, declared their daughter Princess Mary illegitimate, and broken with the Catholic Church in Rome in order to marry Anne and hopefully produce the longed-for male heir that he and Catherine didn't have. Elizabeth's gender was therefore a disappointment, and she was considered the illegitimate product of a bigamous union by most of Catholic Europe. She was baptised at 3 days old in the Church of the Observant Friars, with Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had married her parents and declared the Aragon marriage void, standing as one of her godfathers. Such was the hostility against this little princess, however, that when one attendee was asked if she had been christened in hot or cold water, he replied hot, but not hot enough. In December she was given her own home at Hatfield House outside London, with a lady mistress named Margaret Bryan to care for her, and under the overall watch of Anne Boleyn's aunt and uncle, Sir John and Lady Shelton. Her parents visited her there and at Eltham, where she also sometimes lived, and Anne took great delight in spoiling her little girl with expensive clothes and bedding for her crib, supposedly the crib you see here. She was also joined by her older half-sister Mary, who was sent to Hatfield as little more than a servant in order to punish her for refusing to acknowledge her own and her mother's new positions. This treatment sowed the beginnings of a difficult relationship between the two girls, which would come to a head during Mary's reign. But if you can't wait for me to get to that next week, you can check out my videos on Mary's life to learn some more about it now. Elizabeth remained in Henry's favour during these early years. When Catherine of Aragon died in January 1536, the toddler was paraded around the court by her father to emphasise that he was delighted at the death of his former wife and that Elizabeth was his heir. The Tudors were never much good at playing happy families, however, at least not for long, and it was no different for Elizabeth. At the end of January, her mother miscarried what should have been her little brother, and by the start of May, Henry had fallen for one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, and had had the Queen arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery, treason, and even incest with her brother George. Both Boleyns, along with several others accused with them, were executed in the middle of the month, Anne dying at the Tower of London on the 19th. The Boleyn marriage was annulled, and Elizabeth, just like her sister before her, was declared illegitimate. On the 30th of May, Henry married Jane. Incidentally, if you'd like to learn more about Henry's wives, including his entire relationship with Anne and how Jane supplanted her in his affections, check out my 6 Wives of Henry VIII playlist. I'll leave a link to that on screen and below. With her mother disgraced and killed, the child Henry had flaunted to his court just months earlier was now somewhat forgotten about. In August, Lady Bryan wrote to the King's main minister, Thomas Cromwell, requesting clarity about how she should now refer to the ex-princess and asking for more clothing for the growing Elizabeth. Now, as my Lady Elizabeth is put from that degree she was in, and what degree she is at now I know not, but by hearsay, I know not how to order her or myself, or her women or grooms. I beg you to be good lord to her and hers, and that she may have raiment, for she has neither gown, nor kirtle, nor petticoat, nor linen for smocks, nor kerchiefs, sleeves, reels, body stitchets, handkerchiefs, mufflers, nor begans. Elizabeth was never raised full-time in her mother's household, and it's easy to play down the effect that Anne's death had on a 2-year-old who would be unable to remember her. But the former queen would never have let her daughter want for clothing in this way, and Elizabeth's sartorial problems are a poignant demonstration of one of the many ways in which losing her mother affected her. She noticed her change in position too, asking why one day she was referred to as a princess and the next simply as Lady Elizabeth. Life had to go on though, and the next prominent appearance she made on the royal stage was in October 1537, when the 4-year-old attended the baptism of her new half-brother, Prince Edward. Edward's arrival caused other losses, however. Elizabeth's stepmother, Jane Seymour, died soon after the birth from childbed complications, and Lady Bryan was removed from Elizabeth's household to attend on the new baby. One of her replacements was a woman by the name of Catherine Chapernon, better known as Cat Astley, Astley being her married name. She would become one of Elizabeth's great favourites. The girl's education was soon underway, and she turned out to be incredibly bright and able. She shared some of her tutors with her brother. They often lived in the same household, sometimes with their sister Mary too, and these tutors taught her Latin, French, Italian and Greek. Her handwriting, though it would deteriorate in later life, was initially in a beautiful italic script, and most importantly of all for future events, she was raised a Protestant. David Starkey, whose book on Elizabeth's youth is linked in the description box, has written that there is no evidence that she met Anne of Cleves during her brief tenure as Queen of England, though she did know Henry's 5th wife and Anne Boleyn's cousin, Catherine Howard. Catherine was apparently kind to the girl, and inventories of the Queen's jewellery show that she gave her stepdaughter some inexpensive items as gifts, including a string of beads. Of all her would-be mothers, however, Elizabeth was closest to wife number 6, Catherine Parr. The 31-year-old, twice-widowed Catherine married Henry in July 1543 in Elizabeth and Mary's presence, and the following year, by the 1544 Act of Succession, both girls were restored to the succession after Edward, though neither was re-legitimised. There's some debate amongst historians as to how much of a role Catherine played in Henry's decision to take this step, but whether she was involved or not, she was certainly a good stepmother, who took an interest in Elizabeth's well-being and accomplishments, and who shared many of them too. In July 1544, Henry set sail to go campaigning in France, and during August and September, Elizabeth stayed at court with Catherine, who was now acting as Queen Regent. It gave the girl the opportunity to see effective female rule in action, and we might wonder if she drew on these experiences when she eventually became Queen herself. She also absorbed many of Catherine's religious beliefs, and her New Year's gift to her father for January 1546 was this triple translation into Latin, French and Italian of Catherine's own book, Prayers and Meditations, because she just happened to be the first woman to publish in England in English and under her own name. The introductory letter Elizabeth sent with it also provides an insight into her relationship with the king. She hoped that she would be not just an imitator of his virtues, but an inheritor of them. These final years of Henry's life were therefore a happy time for his second daughter, with a loving, if slightly distant father, a good stepmother, and a positive relationship with her brother and sister, Mary having now softened towards her since they had both been declared illegitimate and displaced by Edward in the line of succession. The next major upheaval in Elizabeth's life wouldn't come until the 28th of January 1547, when the king died. The 13-year-old was told the news alongside her 9-year-old brother, now Edward VI, at her house at Enfield. She was now second in line to the throne after her sister Mary, and one of the wealthiest and most powerful landed magnates in the land. Henry left her an annual income of £3,000 prior to any marriage she might contract, and a slew of lands and houses. As she was still too young to manage her own establishment, however, she soon went to live with her stepmother, Catherine Parr. It was a decision which would have severe repercussions for them both. Catherine Parr had long harboured feelings for Edward VI's younger maternal uncle, Thomas Seymour, and she now had the opportunity to act on them. Seymour, for his part, was initially keen to wed either Elizabeth or Mary, however Henry's will forbade both from marrying without the consent of the new King's Council. This was now headed by Seymour's older brother, Edward, Duke of Somerset, who had taken control of England, and his nephew as Lord Protector of the realm and Governor of the King's person. There was no way Thomas was going to be allowed to marry one of the heiresses to the throne. Thwarted in his initial plan, he married Queen Catherine instead in April, barely 3 months after Henry's death. This made him Elizabeth's stepfather, and what happened next would be the first major scandal of her life. Her servants were later interrogated about the relationship between the pair and gave details of how it had unfolded. Cat Astley admitted that at the Queen and Seymour's house at Chelsea, he would come many mornings into the said Lady Elizabeth's chamber before she were ready, and sometimes before she did rise. And if she were up, he would bid her good morrow and ask how she did, and strike her upon the back or on the buttocks familiarly. And if she were in bed, he would pull open the curtains and bid her good morrow, and make as though he would come at her. It didn't stop there. On one occasion, Thomas tried to kiss Elizabeth in her bed, which Cat Astley reproved him for, and bid him go away for shame. At another house, Seymour Place, he appeared in Elizabeth's room, quote, in his nightgown, bare-legged, in his slippers. At Hanworth in Middlesex, Catherine Parr bizarrely joined in, coming into Elizabeth's chamber with Seymour in the morning and tickling her in her bed. On another day at the same house, Seymour, quote, cut her gown in 100 pieces, being black cloth. When Astley told Elizabeth off, she responded that she could not do with all, for the Queen held her, while the Lord Admiral, which was Thomas's title, cut it. Astley reprimanded Seymour for his behaviour too, telling him it was an unseemly sight to come so bare-legged to a maiden's chamber, and that Elizabeth's reputation was being damaged. But he responded angrily that he would tell his brother, the Lord Protector, how he was slandered, and refused to amend his behaviour, claiming he meant no evil. Despite her earlier connivance and her husband's protests of innocence, it seems Catherine was becoming uneasy with the situation too. She told Astley that she had seen Elizabeth with her arms around a man's neck, something her stepdaughter tearfully denied, as did her servants. Astley, for her part, suspected that the Queen had invented the story out of jealousy in order to make Astley keep a closer watch on her charge, and we have to consider that if Catherine had truly seen Elizabeth with her arms around some strange man's neck, she would have intervened herself right away. Elizabeth's reactions to the situation were mixed. Sometimes she would try to avoid Thomas's advances, shrinking away from him in her bed, or on at least one occasion when she heard him coming into her room, running out of the bed to her maidens, and then went behind the curtains of the bed, the maidens being there. When Seymour tried to persuade her to come out, she wouldn't budge. Yet at other times she appeared to have an adolescent crush on him, and seemed to welcome his attentions, for Cat Astley's husband noted that the Lady Elizabeth did bear some affection to my Lord Admiral. She seemed to be well pleased therewith, and sometimes she would blush when he were spoken of. The breaking point came when a heavily pregnant Catherine walked in on her husband and stepdaughter in each other's arms. Seymour's protests held no sway with her now. She and Elizabeth had an awkward interview, during which Elizabeth, by her own admission, said very little, and the teenager was sent away the next day. This might read as harsh to us, but realistically I think it was the best option available to Catherine, and it removed Elizabeth from Seymour's grasp, which can only have been a good thing. She and her stepmother continued to communicate on friendly terms, but tragically Catherine died in childbed a few months later in early September 1548. Seymour was now free to pursue Elizabeth more openly, and there were rumours that he kept Catherine's large household of ladies together so that they could wait on her once she was his wife. Now that he was no longer married, Cat Astley was much more favourable to the idea of a match with the 15-year-old, but Elizabeth gave very non-committal responses to the idea. When Astley said there was talk in London that Elizabeth and Seymour would be married, Elizabeth brushed it off as but a London news, in other words, just gossip that signified nothing. When Thomas Parry, who was her cofferer, meaning he managed her money for her, asked if she would marry Seymour, she said that, "When that comes to pass, I will do as God shall put in my mind." She expressed doubts that the council would allow such a marriage, however, and as time would show, she was wise to keep Thomas at arm's length. Always seeking more power than he had, Seymour caused a major rift with his brother, the Protector, when it became obvious he was trying to usurp his position, and the Duke of Somerset had Thomas arrested on the 17th of January 1549. It was at that point that several of Elizabeth's servants were placed in the Tower too, resulting in the prisoner statements we've just been looking at, which described Seymour's dealings with Elizabeth. When she herself was interviewed at Hatfield and told of their evidence against her, she refused to admit anything beyond what they had already said, which was embarrassing but not treasonous. She also refused to scapegoat them, though her interrogator, Robert Tyrwhite, said that if she would confess to wrongdoing, it would be blamed on them and her youth taken into account. He found it difficult to get anything out of Elizabeth, however, and he had to admit to the Lord Protector in a letter dated the 23rd of January that "all I have gotten yet is by gentle persuasion, whereby I do begin to grow with her in credit." Furthermore, Elizabeth had a very good wit, and nothing is gotten off her but by great policy. One can't help but get the impression that he begrudgingly admired this clever and cunning teenager who was managing to evade his accusations of improper behaviour so well. Try as he might, he couldn't get her to admit more. Elizabeth now went on the defensive. On the 28th of January, she wrote to the Duke of Somerset exonerating Cat Astley and saying that she had always told Elizabeth not to marry within or beyond England without the Council's consent. Furthermore, she insisted that she would never do so anyway. She swore that she was not lying, for "I know I have a soul to save as well as other folks have," and finished the letter by saying that she had been told that "there goeth rumours abroad, which be greatly both against my honour and honesty, which above all other things I esteem, which be these, that I am in the Tower and with child by my Lord Admiral. My lord, these are shameful slanders, for the which, besides the great desire I have to see the King's Majesty, I shall most heartily desire your lordship that I may come to the court after your first termination, that I may show myself there as I am." In other words, she wanted to provide visual evidence that she wasn't pregnant. Somerset didn't bring her to London, but in the end Elizabeth won, and her servants were released and restored to her. If Thomas Seymour had had even half her brains, he might not have met the end he did. As it was, he was executed on the 20th of March. When Elizabeth heard the news, she remarked that "today died a man of much wit and very little judgment." From an outsider's point of view, Elizabeth had come through the whole ordeal with only some bruising to her reputation. But what might we make of the sordid tale? Well, given Elizabeth's age, the position of trust Seymour held as her stepfather, and above all the wildly inappropriate behaviour he displayed towards her, we would call her the victim of grooming and assault, and we might wonder if part of her future ambivalence towards the whole idea of marriage was rooted in this experience, which was likely psychologically scarring, even if that concept didn't exist in the mid-16th century. At the time, however, it wasn't the age difference — Seymour was a quarter of a century her senior — or Elizabeth's youth which sparked outrage — she was actually old enough to be married by the standards of the day — but the fact that he was married and was taking liberties with someone who wasn't his wife. As we've seen, as soon as Catherine was dead, even Elizabeth's own servant, Cat Astley, suddenly looked much more favourably on him now that a marriage was on the cards. This seems horrific to our eyes, but it demonstrates the gulf between 16th and 21st century mindsets. We would consider Seymour a dangerous predator, but contemporaries thought of him as merely an opportunist, and Elizabeth, who was only aged 13 to 15 during this whole period of time, was the subject of what we would now call victim blaming for what had happened. After the storm of the Seymour scandal, Elizabeth got back to life as normal at Hatfield and her other homes, for she moved around just as modern royalty does, and she now had her own independent household. The remainder of Edward's reign was a relatively peaceful time for her. He and Mary were increasingly at loggerheads over their religious differences — see my videos on them for more details — but as Elizabeth was a Protestant like her brother, they experienced no such problems. Edward called her his sweet sister Temperance, and she spent Christmas with him in 1549, without Mary. A year later, however, all three siblings met for Christmas 1550, and Edward and Mary had an all-out row over her commitment to Catholicism and his to Protestantism. Mary went home early, but Elizabeth stayed and was the leading lady at Edward's court for the remainder of the festivities. She visited him again in March 1552, and her warm relations with him continued. Unfortunately, by the spring of 1553, the now 15-year-old king's health was failing. He died, most likely of tuberculosis, at the beginning of July, and with his passing, a much more dangerous chapter in Elizabeth's life began. To hear all about the trials, tribulations, and close call with the scaffold Elizabeth would have during Mary's reign, make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so you don't miss next week's video, which will look at the nightmarish 5 years Elizabeth had as heir to the throne for her sister. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below what you make of Seymour's treatment of Elizabeth and of the responses of her stepmother, servants, and even herself to it. If you'd like to learn more about her life, there are also links in the description box to books, movies, and TV shows which will tell you all about her. Until next time, keep learning.